The interesting thing about 3D art is that there are many ways to create a specific effect. About 2.5 years ago, I made up a tutorial on how to create stylized fire through a subdivided mesh and a displacement modifier among different things, but today I'd like to show you how to create a stylized fire through an entirely different method that requires no crazy simulations or difficult techniques. Without further ado, let's get started. Unlike my previous method of creating stylized fire, we're going to use a simple plane rather than a stretched out subdivided cube. So just add a plane to your scene and from there open up a second viewport where you can work in the shader tab. Also make sure to switch from cycles to Eevee as a render engine. Cycles won't be necessary and Eevee will get the job done perfectly. In that shader tab we open, you can delete the principled BSDF node and we'll replace it with a mixed shader node setup with an added transparent and emission nodes. I would recommend also going to the options tab on the side, press N if you don't see the tab options on the side, and change the render method from dithered to blended so that the transparency becomes smooth rather than noisy. Starting with the base of the fire, we're going to add in a gradient node setup. It'll be composed of a gradient node with a mapping and texture coordinate nodes that can be added by having the gradient node selected and pressing Ctrl+T. Make sure to have the Node Wrangler add-on to have this work. And then add a color ramp node after the gradient node and connect it to the Mix Shaders node's factor socket. By the way, make sure the texture coordinate node is set to UV. I'll explain why later in the video. To give you an idea of how this works, what will be white will be seen in the final render and what is black will end up transparent. That's how this setup works. Lastly, make sure that the gradient node is set to quadratic sphere and play with the mapping node's location values and the color ramp's black and white sliders until you get the overall size of the fire you want. Now that the gradient node setup is complete, we'll add in a voronoi node setup, which is made up the exact same way, with a texture coordinate and mapping nodes and a color ramp node. By the way, make sure the texture coordinate node is also set to UV, and I'll explain why later in a moment. We're going to connect the voronoi's color ramp node into the mapping node's scale values, and immediately you're going to see the gradient circle displaced in a wacky way. However, with the voronoi node setup, we can control how the displacement works. First off, make sure to turn the black slider into a much lighter gray. The reason why is because the bigger the contrast between black and white, the more intense the displacement. We want something much lighter, so we'll reduce the contrast between the sliders by making the black one a lighter gray. Feel free to play with the voronoi node and its mapping node's value to achieve the kind of displacement you want, and once you're ready, we can get to animation. To animate the fire in the voronoi's mapping node's y-axis location value, type in the code line #frame/-36. This will automate an animation continuously. The lower the value after the /, the faster it'll move. The higher the value, the slower it'll move. For example, if you put 24 instead of 36, then the animation will move faster. If you put 48 instead of 36, it'll move slower. This is the part where I explain the importance of setting your texture coordinate nodes to UV. When you add a plane in Blender, its UVs are automatically set, which means that if you give it shaders that are driven by the UV coordinates, you can affect the shape of those shaders by modifying the geometry of that object, in our case, the plane. So as you can see here, I added a few loop cuts to my plane, so that I can modify its general shape into fire, and the shaders that are UV driven will automatically follow that flow, and bam! Just like that, I got myself stylized fire. By the way, don't forget to add in a subdivision modifier to smooth the fire out. Now, before we move on to the next step, I would also recommend playing a bit more with your gradient and voronoi node setup values to get the kind of fire you're looking for. You can make the displacement stronger or weaker, or even make the animation go slower or faster like I showed you earlier in the video. There are many ways to color the fire. All that you have to do is plug in whatever texture you want into the emission shader and use a color ramp node to choose your colors. I experimented a little but eventually decided to go with a linear gradient texture that goes from a bright white to a fiery red. And 2 quick tips to make it look better. 1. Change the color display to standard to get more alluring colors. You can do that by going into the render tab settings, go to color management and changing display to standard. 2. Open up the compositor tab and add in a glare node to create a glow effect. Make sure to enable the compositor in your viewport by clicking on the down arrow at the top and selecting always for the compositor. And don't forget to turn up your emission shader for the glare to appear, As for the glare type, I typically go between bloom or fog glow. And that's it. You got yourself a stylized fire in Blender made entirely in a simple plane. No need for complex simulations or crazy methods. One extra step I would like to show you is how to have the fire always pointing towards the camera. You see, since this is a 2D plane and you'll most likely have the camera move around, you want to make sure the fire is visible at its best from all angles. And it's really simple. Start by adding a camera to your scene. Then select your fire plane and go to its Object Constraints tab. In the selection of constraints, choose Track To. And for the target, pick your camera. Now if your plane turns into a weird angle, no worries. You just need to change which track axes to choose and which one points up. And again, no worries if this sounds confusing. To figure out which axes to choose, just change the axis up top from global to local. Disable the constraint just for a second, and now you can see which axis to track and which one is pointing up. So for example here, blue points upwards, so my up axis is Z. And the axis that is going through the plane is Y. So for the track axis, I choose either Y or -Y. Try either or to see which one works and voila! Now your object plane tracks with your camera perfectly. Now, whatever angle you're looking at your fire plane at with your camera, it'll face it perfectly. Alright, so this is it for the stylized fire VFX for today. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you have any questions, leave them in the comment section below and I'll get to them as fast as I can. Bye bye.